Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show podcast. This episode is going to be all about football hooliganism and antisocial behaviour. I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Les Back, who's been on the show before. Nice to see you again, Les, and also Dr. Isaac Hoff. So let's do some introductions to start with. So Les, tell us a little bit about who you are and most importantly, who you support, of course.
Well, but it's great to be involved in your show again, Matthew. Always a delight. But yeah, my name's Les Back. I teach sociology at the University of Glasgow. Before that, I taught at Goldsmiths College, which is a kind of link to my team because I'm a South Londoner and my team is Millwall. Although my family are traditionally Palace supporters, I went a different way in, so I've been a devotee of Millwall Football Club pretty much all my life.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Isaac, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi, I'm Isaac Hoff. I'm a tutor in media, culture and society at the University of Glasgow. Thanks for inviting me on. It's really nice to be here for the first time, talking about something that I'm very passionate about. I also work at the University of Glasgow, and my team is Leicester City. The roller coaster of emotions that is supporting that team, the ups, the downs, but I think more back into our natural place now. I think the world of being a yo-yo team suits us very well. But since moving to Glasgow, I do try and follow a little bit of Partick Thistle as well.
Thank you. Thank you. It's interesting you say the ups and downs because I'm a Brighton fan. If you're watching, you can see I'm a Brighton fan, by the way. And in the almost 40 years that I've been supporting Brighton, we've been in all four divisions. We've been 92nd in the league. And at the time of recording, we are top of the Premier League. 2 games in, but I'll take it, So it's been a fantastic journey. So guys, thanks for joining me then. So we were going to talk about football hooliganism. There are media reports, police reports, and statistics that suggest post-COVID, we have seen a return to antisocial behaviour, more arrests, more football violence, and it seems to definitely be on the rise. I just wondered, what's your initial thoughts? Obviously, it's a culmination of lots of different factors, but what would you attribute the main factors to be for that rise? Isaac, should I come to you first, if you don't mind?
Yeah, I think it's interesting really thinking about in the context of post-COVID. I think a lot of it would be being pent up. I think having spent, a year, 2 years really being cooped up indoors, not really being able to have any kind of in-person social life, not being able to kind of go and do the things that you'd want to do, I think will play a big part in it. And almost that kind of that first time out, really, almost like that first time out and about in years, and people really kind of letting it all out. I think that's a part of it. I also think we're living in quite testing times for a lot of people. I think there are a lot of frustrations at plenty of things in terms of cost of living crisis, but also maybe political frustrations as well that become expressed and I think are given voice through these forms of violence, even though they might not be explicitly, saying political demands, so to speak. So I think it's that mixture of the two things really. And also when we think about when you read things about football hooliganism or antisocial behaviour in grounds now, the prevalence of cocaine, being a kind of becoming a very normal part of young people's, in particular, leisure practices, in terms of whether it's, boozing, probably traditionally in football, now maybe shifting a little bit towards that and the impacts that would inevitably have on people's state of being, really.
That's interesting you say that because in preparation for the show, I just asked a few fellow fans, what do you think? And someone instantly said, it's simple. Booze is expensive. Coke's got cheaper. That was their first response.
Yeah. And it is interesting thinking about that shift in terms of, I mean, I can only speak in terms of, when you think about leisure and going out and things like that, in terms of how it's become something that's, kind of proliferated out from the nighttime economy, traditionally in terms of clubbing, bars, and things like that, to become something that just is what people do to kind of get up for things, you know. And I think with football as well, that kind of heightened sense of being an awareness kind of factoring into the kind of, I would say, the kind of accenting the enjoyment you get at being in football grounds anyway, the atmosphere, the kind of back and forth, and then that added element feeding into, you know, kind of, you know, multiplying those senses and feelings, I guess. But it's really interesting that seems to become a source of a normal thing people do at football now.
Les, if I could come on to you as well, what were your initial thoughts?
I think that's right. I mean, I think that the sort of patterns, the social patterns of drug use are a feature in this, and you know, it's interesting too, isn't it? I think sometimes those patterns tell us something about the sort of changing nature of consumption and of and also patterns of leisure and how that reflects on social distinctions around class and masculinity and those kinds of questions. You know, when you think about the association of cocaine now, it was very different than, you know, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And, you know, not a kind of a glamorous elite drug any longer. And I think there's something about that. These are all patterns and shifts, I think, as sociologists, that are clues to wider ways in which social distinctions and distinction making work. But I would say as well, Matthew, you know, one of the things that's important always, and one of the kind of resources that sociologists give us and sociology gives us, is the way in which we are constantly alert to the limits of the way in which moral categories get produced in society, which sort of label deviant behavior. Football hooliganism has been prone to this, you know. There's no doubt, you know, it's not to sort of be romantic about violence or anything like that, but, you know, one of the first questions for us as sociologists is to question the terms of the way in which public concern is framed and understood. And I think that's one of the things which is particularly, you know, relevant when we think about football-related violence and conflict, and to think, well, what's going on there? What are these affects allegiances, the way identities work, and the way in which sport particularly plays a key role in providing a vehicle for the expression of a sense of self, of joy, of passion. And sometimes those passions can spill over into more conflictual emotions. But I think that thing about, well, why sport is interesting, because it's a place we can see both the shape of moral concern and the panics that circulate in society, but also the way in which people mobilize their sense of self, their sense of place, and their sense of belonging.
Yeah, and just wanting to pick up on what Les said there, thinking about the term football hooliganism and the kind of traditionally class connotations between football and working classness in the UK anyway. It's interesting to think about the ways in which hooliganism as a term kind of invokes ideas of this braying mob, you know, essentially this lawless mob, which has been used and is a brush that's been used by tabloid newspapers in particular to tar working class people, really. And I think that kind of that moralizing of working class people as potentially lawless has a kind of very long history, a long political history, right? And I think it's really interesting to think about how those kind of, you know, quote unquote concerns around collective working class life or expressions of working class identity, particularly in relation to football fandom, factors into so many things in the ways in which, you know, if you look at how football is policed, and some might argue is over policed in ways that other collective leisure-based occasions, particularly in relation to sport, simply aren't. So I think Les is exactly right in thinking, in kind of drawing attention to the ways in which even the media framings of or mediatized framings of, you know, football violence, say, actually is embedded in within this kind of longer moralizing and almost civilizing mission of, you know, working classes, which also is interesting in relation to football, you know, as well. In you know, when it was first becoming a thing in its history, you know, Victorian, you know, world doers seeing football as a civilizing mission to the working classes, you know, as a means to instill in them proper values. So I think it's really interesting thinking about those moral aspects in the ways in which it's spoken about as well.
In that respect, I did wonder as we were coming into this podcast, are we seeing kind of a classic moral panic? Because I have seen some references to saying this is, you know, we're going back to the dark days of the 1980s. I'm not sure about that. You know, I'm seeing more antisocial behavior recently. If I was to put it bluntly, a lot of young kids acting like dickheads on a Saturday, right? But to say back to the 80s and what we were seeing on the terraces then, I think that's a stretch, is it not?
I think it's a big stretch. I mean, you know, I think in a way, a more interesting problem for us to think about is, well, what do these patterns tell us about both the shape of moral concern, but also the experience of life, you know? And Millwall has always been like the exemplary hooligan club. You know, it's a weird thing that, you know, being a fan and also just experiencing going to football, it never, that the image that you would see on the tabloid and in the tabloid press never squared with what it was like to be a fan and to what it was like to be in those crowds. And you know, I remember a hilarious moment, Matthew, which is relevant to your club, when there was concerns about the relationship between hooliganism and racism. A police officer took me to one. So I did a project on football culture and multiculture and racism some years ago now, almost 20 years ago. And a police officer from down in Brighton took me to one side and said, "Oh, you know, there was this concern about, you know, Brighton fan Zeke Hiling in the crowd."
Yeah.
And it was a complete misreading of the fact that they were not chanting "Sea Carl," they were chanting "Seagulls." You know, and it's that kind of thing which I think sport particularly is a good place to think about how these unfold, and football particularly. And so, but the other thing about this as well is that, you know, the way in which football clubs become a vehicle, not just for men and their passions for the game, but they do become a vehicle for the way in which the lived experience of class unfolds, you know. And in a way, I think, is it coming back, or is it as bad as it was in the 80s? I don't think that's as an interesting question to say, well, what is circulating? And you know, a brilliant and useful theorist that I know that Isaac's also inspired by has a tremendous sort of way of naming this. Raymond Williams understands our experience as life as structured forms of feeling. And those structured forms of feeling for Williams always have what he would call a residual element. That is an element that's forged in the past, as well as an emergent element, that which is emerging in the present, and the interplay between those two things. And as well as a dominant feature, a feature that is being imposed. And there's something, I think, about the way in which the sort of residual aspects of class-based experience are still being mobilized within football culture. And maybe that's partly what we're seeing interrupting the present, is that the legacy and the residual elements of that, of those affinities, of those commitments, those passions, and also those allegiances and conflicts that are unfolding. I'm always struck at Millwall, you know, the great kind of call for the Millwall fans is the Lions roar, this sort of wordless moo, you know, you hear thousands of people chant that sort of drone, which is like the Lions roar. I'm really mindful these days of how shrill the sound of the Lions roar is. They're young voices they're not the voices of people who were forged in the, early and mid 20th century ecology of London's docks. They're not. They're often young people from the hinterlands of southeast London who are coming back to New Cross and Deptford to commune with the residual aspects of that cultural experience.
Yeah, and just picking up from that, I think one of the really interesting things, especially about kind of football culture and those kind of residual elements of class, we think about the complete transformation of the way in which class is experienced and how it's rooted in those kind of economic forms of life, but also place-based forms of life. I think there's something really interesting looping back to kind of hooliganism and that really kind of pioneering research from Leicester in the 80s and the 90s, thinking about ideas around and expressing a kind of territorialization. It's a means to kind of, articulate a sense of place and defending a place that you have a potential investment in. As, someone who might be from a kind of particular area or associated with a particular club, I find interesting with that kind of that Millwall example you were talking about there, Les, is that notion of, there might be people, like you say, that kind of image of these kind of stereotypical, imaginaries of the working class that we might associate with football fans of the 70s and 80s in relation to hooliganism is gone. That world to some extent is gone, but actually those notions perhaps of territoriality, but also just coming together and having a sense of collective, a real one of maybe the few instances in contemporary life where people might not feel as atomized or as individualized. You are together as, we're Millwall fans, or it's like you, Matthew, Brighton, me, Leicester. One of the few chances that you maybe have, or young people or people feel like they have to feel like they're a part of something bigger than themselves that represents a kind of connection to a world that might have gone, or a place that they aren't as actively rooted in anymore, maybe.
Yeah, I did wonder if some of it was a search for a subculture, particularly post COVID, young men looking for something to do and be a part of. And something struck me. I noticed at a Brighton game recently, and I actually had a chat with a group of lads. They were dressed in what I would call casual gear, right? They all had the Stone Island on, and some of them had the Aqua Scutum on, and they were having a beer and they were singing in a particular way. I don't think they were actually up for a fight or anything at all. Not in any way. In fact, they probably would have run. I would have run with them, if it all kicked off, without a doubt. But the image, the look, the identity to be a part of something, that seemed to be more important than the actual antisocial violence itself.
Yeah, you see, I think as well, this is where, the sort of sociological reflex to question the moral judgments that are circulating is a really useful one, because it makes us think more broadly and less narrowly about, accepting the terms of the sort of moral quandary or the moral dilemma that's circulating within the media and other places. And so I think that's exactly right, to be asking those questions about, well, what forms of collective affinity are being mobilized? What are their bases? What are the resources? And, I think it's not that thing about, and it's the great lesson from Williams, is that the past never stays behind us. It's never lapsed. It's always socially alive. So the idea for Williams that those cultural references to place or a family connection to a place, say, they remain residual, but they're not dormant. They're very much active. So they can shape. They can be some of the resources that, like the group of fans that you're describing, can draw on. And whether it's, the fashion of the casuals that, is but a little bit dated now, it comes back to life. It comes back to life because it's not completely consigned to the past.
And it's interesting thinking, I was just thinking about that kind of casuals look when you were speaking, Matthew. I was thinking, that, get the badge in thing, with the Stonies and the Stone Island things and stuff like that. I do think there is something very much in that affinity to a kind of style and a look that, again, it's you classically say it's quite subcultural. But I also think as well, questioning the return to the dark days of the 80s, just going back to that, you only have to go to football grounds now and who's there, the probably class makeup of the crowd, in terms of, I mean, particularly with Leicester, a lot more probably racially diverse than it might have been in those days. That's going to completely transform the feel of football, and some have argued that football's gone through, it's shifted from its kind of working class roots into something maybe a bit more middle class, I can't say the word, but the bourgeoisement thing, the bourgeoisement thing. So it's also putting these kind of moral quandaries and articulations of collective style in with kind of changes with who goes to football, who's it pitched at, who can afford to go to football, particularly in the Premier League and the Championship.
Yeah.
Actually, who are these people actually we're talking about, and how might their kind of class, race, gendered, but also sexual kind of identities and the way in which they intermingle interact with the dominant and the emergent to constitute new forms of collectivity within football, but also how that might spill over into those kind of passions of, when it gets a bit, heated and violent and things like that. That's going to also have an impact on the ways in which these things are expressed, I think,
Yeah, I mean, I'll be visiting the Amex tomorrow. It's certainly a global international scene. We get a lot of Japanese fans at the moment supporting Matoma, and quite a lot of South American players at Brighton. It is a different atmosphere. So I'm just wondering, are we completely squashing our hypothesis that football hooliganism is on the rise? Is perhaps that not completely true, and we are just seeing a media depiction of the very worst fans as opposed to a true reality?
I mean, I suppose it's all relative. Maybe it's that thing of you spend a long time, you don't hear a lot about it, and then, you have a relative spike in this kind of activity that becomes more visible, that it kind of looks like maybe there is it's a return to all these terrible things. But, I think it's about contextualizing it relatively as well to what we have seen, what we haven't seen over maybe the last 15, 20 years, particularly in relation to English football.
Yeah.
Sorry, let's not cut you off a little bit.
No, it's the same. There's a similar point that you're making. I mean, I think that it's what question do we ask? What questions does it pose? I think that's the thing. Just thinking about the audience, your audience, Matthew, and students studying sociology. I think that's the lesson here, is that we can't just be satisfied with the way in which this question is posed within the media and within news reporting. It's not that those things aren't happening. Of course they are happening. There is something happening. There's a shift. What that shift might signal is for us to think hard about, and I think the truth is that there's been tremendous regulation and surveillance of football as a form of popular culture, perhaps more than any other, actually. Well, the surveillance and policing of nighttime spaces and dances and clubs is another question, but and related. But in a way, it's like, well, okay, well, if there is a pushback against those forms of regulation coming out of COVID, then what does that tell us? I think it does tell us something about the tussle, the struggle that's going on around the expression of self and an unfolding of life, and the way in that sense of an unfolding life is regulated, and the push and pull between those things. I think that's what's so interesting in what's unfolding now. So to say, that football hooliganism is on the rise again sidelines the way in which this kind of sphere of life is incredibly regulated and incredibly policed.
And just picking up from what Les was saying again, for students and things like that, I think the questions that we want to ask, and I think when we're thinking sociologically, particularly around something like sport or popular culture or expressions of self, is that relationship between continuity and change, and always there's always a kind of historical element to what we're doing and how we want to think about things as well. So it's always thinking through, well, relative to maybe pre-COVID, football violence has gone up, but what are the trends and what are the underlying issues that are driving that? And also, how do people make sense of that? You know, if you speak to, I'm sure the people who are, you speak to people who are involved in this antisocial behaviour or whatever, they'd give you a range of explanations that might speak to continuities and change, the emergent, the residual, and however we want to frame it. And I think that's also one of the most important things, looping back to what you're saying, Matthew, about we quashed a hypothesis. Well, not necessarily. It's just about being attendant to continuity and change and those kind of shifts that happen and how they come to be expressed through, everyday forms of engagement with popular culture, football in this instance, I guess.
Yeah, because one of the things that I was thinking is that I think there's a lot more self-policing and regulation. I was thinking about a couple of games that I went to last year where there was some, I would call it idiotic behaviour rather than violent behaviour post game, and people were calling out, "Don't do that." There's some lads kicking off wing mirrors on cars as we were being marched to the station. Other people said, "Don't do that. Just stop it. Don't be a dickhead, mate." Basically, people were saying.
Yeah.
And similarly in grounds, I'd like to think all our teams, if you heard someone shout out a horrific, racist, homophobic comment, I think people would call that person out and they'd tell the steward. So I just wonder if we're seeing more regulation of it, and that's perhaps warping our idea of how bad it actually is.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that is right. I mean, I think there's an app, but classically how we would understand it in terms of how to analyze a moral panic, there's processes of amplification going on. Yeah, this is one of Stan Cohen's great concepts, from way back now in the 70s. You see how the moral concern is amplified through the way these patterns of reporting. And I would guess you're absolutely right, Matthew, about that process of regulation of sort of kind of collective fan self-regulation and actually determining what the parameters of conduct is and what's out of order and what's in order. So I think that's definitely the case, but I think there's something too about the desire for sort of a sense of self, of sovereign, a sense of sovereign self, a sense of an expressed culture that is shared, that I think is also at play, and the definition of how those ideas of identity and belonging and place and collectivity are being articulated. And I think the way that that's operating in public through football culture is always really interesting. It's an interesting sign of something. Those identities that are either being discredited or suppressed, and then the pushback against that process, of regulating and policing what's allowed, and I think that football culture has been a very powerful sort of sphere in which that struggle can unfold.
Yeah, and I think it's coming to them ideas around contestation and popular culture being a key site of contestation in relation to push back what is and what isn't considered appropriate. I mean, the notion that people will you obviously hear incidences of racist abuse in stadiums, homophobic abuse, particularly in relation to Brighton traditionally. People, football is a site where, as you're saying, people self-regulate in a way that is different, and it does take into account some that kind of provisionally takes into account some elements of what we would have once called progressive social and cultural change, and the way in which that changes the kind of parameters of exactly what Les was saying, what is on and what is considered not to be on, and all those kind of things. So I think I think football culture more broadly, but football, but popular culture more broadly, it's that thing around contestation, and the working out of identities in relation to change, but also continuity as well. Yeah.
Thank you. And I might make this the last question, but it's quite a big area. When I was asking people in preparation for the show, what do you think it's down to? As I said, people mentioned the ubiquity of cocaine use, financial crisis, post-COVID, and so on. But the word that kept on coming up time and time again was masculinities. And Isaac, I know you've written extensively about this. Toxic masculinity, the term came up. Lost males, not knowing where they're going, directionless. How much of this do you think this is about masculinity? To use a phrase that's used in sociology a lot, a crisis of masculinity. Are we experiencing that for a lot of young men today, do you think?
I think, I mean, I'm not sure I fully subscribe to the idea of a crisis in masculinity. If we only have to look at the continuing persistence of inequalities between men and women, economically, socially, culturally, and politically, I think to get at that notion. It's hard to know, really. I think it's a really difficult question because football's long been what some would call gender typed as a particularly masculinized space, right? And I think in a way with that kind of the kind of association with football and masculinity, and a particular form of masculinity, one that is rooted in what Raywin Connell would call hegemonic masculinity, right? Around exhibiting physical dominance, primarily if we're going to talk about fighting, right, and defending one's honor, and etc. etc. I suppose for a long time, I think it's a space where, in a way, it could be argued, I think, that it's expected to some extent of these kind of spaces that men may or may not engage in these kind of masculinized practices, which in other spheres of their life would maybe be policed in a much more different way. In terms of whether this is expressive of a crisis, I'm not sure. I don't necessarily think so. But then if we put it in a broader context around men and gender, if we see the kind of growing popularity of people like Andrew Tate in the manosphere and the kind of real insidious things that they talk about and spread and that have influence on really being overtly misogynistic, I think if we put it in that kind of broader context, there is clearly something going on with men and masculinities. Whether these are expressives of a crisis, I think it depends how we define crisis. You know, are we talking about men losing their relative status compared to maybe 50 years ago? Well, who's that a crisis for? You know, it becomes then, if we're talking in those terms, it becomes one person's progress is the loss of another, where actually we know that that's not necessarily the case, and we shouldn't use that as a justification, maybe not to change these things, right? But yeah, I think it's a very complicated, difficult question to end on. But I think there's, you know, it's something rooted in a very kind of hegemonic form of masculinity, I think, in which that it's a space where it's expected to some extent to be expressed. And I think that's very much a continuity with how we would see football culture and football hooliganism, you know, from the 70s onwards, maybe.
Les, I wondered if you had any thoughts on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the crisis of masculinity type way of thinking about these issues, really, it kind of it touches something and confines us at the same time. It feels like, I mean, what is unfolding, it seems to me, are really the structural transformations of life and of the economy of community life too, which I do think play into the patterns we're talking about. You know, so in a sense that the sort of the movement from a kind of industrial to a post-industrial landscape, new kinds of work, new patterns of work, new patterns of embodied life that are unfolding too, you know. And it seems to me that if there's a crisis in, well, what kinds of identities and sense of self unfold in this very, very changing, mercurial sort of world, and I think, again, there's something about the connection to and affinity with patterns of life that in many ways have been superseded by the economic landscape and the social landscape in which they emerge, that I think is really interesting. So how does one express a sense of personal mastery in that sense in a landscape that's shifting like that? And if football culture is implicated in how those patterns unfold in the way that Isaac is talking about, then, well, how does this form of pattern of leisure and culture connect to these wider transformations? I think there's something about that is deeply challenging, about a relation to place, a relation to a sense of self, an embodied life. So much of the pattern of football fandom is about embodied life. And I guess the thing that I think is so interesting for us is, well, how does it relate then to the changing nature of those communities, the changing nature of the economy itself, and the forms of livelihood and work that are unfolding there? So, it seems to me it asks us questions not just about a particular crisis of gendered identity, but a question about, well, how is the nature of community and social life being transformed? And there's something about that I think is really important to be open to.
Yeah, and I just wanted to pick up on. I was just thinking about something when you were talking there, Les, about the notion of this kind of attachment to a particular form of life which has been superseded. I mean, there might be something in the idea that young, maybe not even working class men, but young middle class, upper working class men, people who are lucky enough to afford to go to football games now, they might see engaging in forms of football violence at the worst and antisocial behaviour, football, maybe on the kind of lower end of the spectrum, depending on how we define it, as something that they would perceive as what guys or lads who go to football do, in the absence of those forms of collective economic community and family life, which would have ensured or sustained a kind of more stably traditional hegemonic masculinity, right? Where, if we only have to look at the cultural landscape, where elements of feminism have been taken into common sense thinking around gender. Okay, it's contested, it's not won and anything like that. But that idea that, well, actually going to football and maybe having a scrap, or having a couple of lines, having a scrap, or shout, kicking wing mirrors off. Well, this is what guys who go to football do, because back in my dad's day or whatever, that's what he said people did, and so you can see that those kind of attachments, I think, playing out through a kind of maybe a kind of gender performance of an expectation of what collective gendered identities are in those spaces.
So I'm just wondering on that point then, Isaac, do you think a small element of it will always be attached to football because that's just the way that it is?
I would be, again, you don't want to essentialize and reproduce those tropes around working classness and masculinity and particular forms of violence in a kind of, oh, this is like some sort of hardwired ingrained thing. But I think there is something possibly within football culture that is very much, it's just there, and I think I would be surprised if it, dissipated. But again, I think that's maybe because we're very hyper aware of that within football, rather than in other kind of sports or whatever. But I would be, you can't make predictions, but I it's just so persistent within football culture. We do see it crop up again and again.
Let's
It's a kind of yearning for authenticity, I think, Matthew. a yearning for authenticity, which again we see that this is so. These aren't, they're not straightforward. These patterns of culture. There's a lot of yearning for authenticity, a sense of place, a connection, and it doesn't necessarily it isn't necessarily so fixed to structural differences as well. I think as Isaac was talking there, there's lots of people who are drawn to the performance of a kind of working class masculinity that weren't necessarily born into it. And so that's what I think is interesting and curious about football culture particularly, but also popular culture more broadly. This is the place where these things are unfolding, and where we can see some of those both those desires and also the sort of attempts to enact them or perform them unfolding. And the whole politics of identity, of how that links to social differentiation is an incredibly fascinating aspect of what it means to think sociologically today. I mean, I just had this example which a friend sent to me from London Transport recently. London Transport trying to show itself to be inclusive and open to all Londoners, has a poster with the rainbow flag, a kind of queer celebration of gay London life, and the caption is, "Here in London, you're free to love whoever you love and to be whoever you truly are." And then some rascal has scribbled underneath that, "I heart Millwall." And in a way, I don't know what the motivations behind that were, but you could see that's the kind of the unfolding contest about, well, what kinds of forms of love are permissible, what kinds of identities are to be recognized publicly and celebrated, and which identities have to be sort of scribbled and in forms of illicit inscriptions and graffiti.
I just wondered. I mean, this sounds like a little bit of a cop out of the conclusion, but there's no doubt the game's changing now. We've just seen the popularity of the Women's World Cup. Whether we're going to see the Middle Eastern market just grow and grow, and that will be the new league to go to, a more global games. There's no doubt the game is changing, but I just wondered, to go back to what Isaac said, there still be that element of the traditional, if you like, and maybe in a negative sense, the traditional working class man's game, that will remain.
I think it's really interesting as well. It's those changes you're talking about, but I mean, I live opposite of goals, right? So it's like, five-side football, all that. And, the popularity of small-sided games also speaks to a changing participation within football for people who play. But you only have to go down there and you see all women's league, you have inclusive leagues where you have people who are non-binary playing, you have things like that, and then you have like mixed teams where you'll have like games of all abilities, where it'll be men, women, non-binary people as well, more racially mixed, etc., things like that. So I even think we only have to look at things we might walk by in the park to see how football itself is changing, not in just terms of consuming the elite game, but seeing how its popularity and how more people are partaking in it is indicative of broader social, cultural change more broadly, but within football itself. I mean, I'd say I've been playing five-a-side a long time. I'd even say 5-10 years ago, you would not see that personally, right? And I think that's only a good thing, and I think it's indicative exactly of that, the extent to which that it's all these things happening at once. I think that what we consider traditional, new, or in Williams' terms, dominant, emergent, and residual, all happening at once, and tracing all those things, like when you study culture or sociology or whatever, you follow one thread and it doesn't really lead anywhere. It just leads to something else and something else and something else.
You see, I think the thing, Matthew, and to come back to where we started, football hooliganism as a kind of spectacular social phenomenon and a public concern has held our imaginations as sociologists hostage for a long time. It's the thing that we circle back to, or that you know, media commentators circle back to repeatedly. But actually, as Isaac was just describing then, if you think about sport and football as a form of popular culture and what is alive there, what's unfolding there, the tangle of things that are unfolding, the past, the present, the emergent and the future, you know, there is so much that stimulates us and invites us to think harder about the kind of social worlds that are unfolding. And so in a way, football hooliganism is fascinating, but in a way, in another sense, we need to make sure it doesn't confine and limit the ways in which we can think sociologically about sport and popular culture more broadly.
I think that is a perfect time to end, gentlemen. I think you concluded it perfectly for me, Les. That's great. Thank you so much for your time today, guys. And maybe we could pick up and do another one of these, because I could have talked for longer. I don't know about you.
Speak for hours about football. Speak for hours about football.
That's great. That's great. And you're both on Twitter, so if listeners do want to add you at all, find out more about your work, they can add you on Twitter.
Yep. Yeah, they can. Can send you something over when this gets posted, and you can, you know, maybe some, you know, tag us in that.
Sure, will do. Thanks again for your time, guys.
No,
Take care.
No,
Take care.
Good luck to your good luck to your teams this weekend as well.
Yeah, indeed.
Don't get me started. All right, could be fine. Anyway,
Cheers, guys.
take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye now.
Take care. Bye-bye.